Good afternoon, everyone, or good evening, or good morning, wherever you might be. I am Paul Clements with the Climate Change Working Group at Western Michigan University. And I want to thank you again for being part of this symposium, Climate Migrant Symposium, as we explore practical responses to the serious challenges that climate migration faces. And we're looking particularly at urban areas. And for that focus, this particular panel is particularly relevant. We'll have three really great speakers addressing migrants adapting in cities. And first, just a little bit of housekeeping. You all know that this is a recorded session. If you think of questions while the panelists are speaking, please use the Q&A function at the bottom of your screen, and please go ahead and put your questions in there even when you're thinking about them. And then after the three panelists speak, then we'll have a chance, I'll have a chance to read your questions out loud. And depending on whether time permits, we may have a chance for me to call on some of you individually to speak your questions. So each panelist is going to have between 15 to 18 minutes, and I'll introduce each one of them at the time when they're going to be speaking. The first one is Chiamaka Rita Apuagu. She is, let me get her information here. She's a lawyer, migration researcher, and climate mobility fellow at the Global Center for Climate Mobility. She serves as deputy academic coordinator for the European Master in Migration and Intercultural Relations at Karl von Ostius, the Universität Oldenburg, excuse my German, in Germany. Her work spans academia, international organizations, and grassroots initiatives across Nigeria, Germany, Norway, and Czechia. Chiamaka has contributed to migration policy at the International Organization for Migration, conducted archival research on migration histories, and supported the reintegration of returning migrants in Nigeria. She co-founded Blank Pages Global, fostering intercultural understanding in Oldenburg, Germany, and has been recognized as one of the UN SDNS Nigeria's top 10 climate innovators. Her research and practice integrate migration, gender equality, and climate justice. She will be speaking on colonial legacies, coastal precarity, and climate justice in Badagry, Lagos. And with that, I'll turn it over to Chiamaka.
Give me a moment, please, to get this right. So for some reason, I'm unable to change my slides. I sincerely apologize.
No problem, Chiamaka. Why don't you try to stop screen sharing and then start again?
Yeah, I'll do that. Can you see my screen now?
Not yet. Feel free to share. If it's a Google Slides link, you can share it with me, and I'm happy to share my screen.
I think that should work better. I can share the link with you.
Thank you all for bearing with us. We can see your screen now.
Still the same issue. I can't change the slide, so I'll just share the link with you.
No problem. Okay, great. Chimaka, I've just requested access.
I just granted it.
Great. Give me one moment and we'll be up and running shortly.
I sincerely apologize to the panelists and participants for this issue. Perfect. Okay,
You're
can
ready
I
to
start
roll?
now?
Yes, absolutely, absolutely. Go ahead.
Okay, great. Let me start by saying thank you to Paul for the warm and kind introduction. My name is Chiamaka Rita Akpogu. I am currently a Climate Mobility Fellow with the Global Center for Climate Mobility. And today I'll be sharing insights into this topic on the nexus of colonial legacies, coastal precarity, and climate justice in Badagry, Lagos. Could you please change the slide? Thank you very much. And so here I hope to be setting the scene why this inquiry matters. As has probably been discussed earlier during the symposium, Africa sits at the front line of the climate crisis, yet contributes less than 4% of global emissions. Zooming into Lagos now, which is Nigeria's economic hub, it faces severe flooding, coastal erosion, infrastructural fragility, among others. And then in Lagos is Badagry, a community that was a historic slave port, and that is now at the peripheries. And so I hope to, through this presentation, expand on how colonial legacies shape vulnerability today. And so my research question is how the colonial histories and governance patterns continue to shape climate precarity in Lagos. Next slide, please. In conducting this research, it has a qualitative design. It's qualitative. In undertaking this research, I was unable to conduct the interviews or conduct more hands-on direct data in this regard. And so my data collection was constrained to existing research in this field, policy documents, media sources, indigenous news outlets like Punch, but then international news outlets were also consulted in addition to academic sources. My goal was to analyze and glean narratives around vulnerability, governance, and justice as it pertains to Badagry. And then it's imperative to also mention my positionality. So I grew up in Lagos, Nigeria. I'm Nigerian, Lagosian, that's the term that is often used. And this has made me an insider of sorts, but then it has also imbued me with this lived experience, my own reality of the urban divides in Lagos State, the climate challenges there. And so this is something that has given me more contextual insights. I was aware of this and I tried to be reflexive in undertaking this research to balance both my proximity in this sense with critical distance that is required to provide or produce knowledge that is rigorous and ethical in this regard. Next slide, please. And so to frame the problem, I thought to throw more light on this nexus of climate and inequality, the nexus as it pertains to Lagos, and then as we proceed, I will delve into Badagry in particular. So for Lagos, 84% of Lagos State's coastline has receded over the past 50 years due to a combination of coastal erosion, sea level rise, intensified rainfall, frequent flooding, and poor drainage infrastructure. This, according to sources, as at 2020, culminated in annual losses exceeding $4 billion. And as at 2025, you can imagine that this has amounted to even more losses. But what we see, however, is that climate impacts are unevenly distributed. Affluent areas receive more protection. I will expand on that in the case study in the next few slides. And coastal areas like Badagry that are at the peripheries bear the brunt. And so we see the dominant responses, however, to the climate challenges are technocratic, follow the typical top-down model of governments that are in some ways not aligned or aware of the lived realities of those at the front lines, enacting policies that have little effect on the experiences of those at the front line. And so this is problematic. But what we see, though, a single strand that followed through the research was this uneven exposure of communities, which reflects how and replicates the colonial logic of how colonial era divisions of land and power continue to shape who faces greater risks in this respect climate risks even today. Next slide, please. And so the question becomes, why Badagry in particular, right? And I focused specifically on Badagry because it was it used to be a historic slave port in Nigeria. Approximately, according to Sorensen and Gilmore, approximately 35% of enslaved Africans were trafficked through the Badagry coast. And so it bears significance in this regard. And we are obviously aware of the atrocities perpetrated during that time, and that was integral to slave trade. But then another dimension that I found really enlightening happened to be the spiritual violence that was also perpetrated in Badagry. During the slave trade, a complaint, according to oral tradition and then replicated in sources like Oyedero in 2017, the oral beliefs was that the so-called enslaved persons were often reluctant to be subjugated, to obey these slave masters, as the case may be. And in dealing with this issue, the perpetrators of this slave trade worked hand in hand with the traditional leaders, especially in Badagry, to enchant a well. And the goal in enchanting this well was to somehow ensure that slaves that were getting trafficked out of this coast had to drink from the well in order to erase their memories and engender docility. And so this was another dimension that I found intriguing, how not only was the violence perpetrated against the persons, but then also the violence perpetrated by erasing memories of those enslaved. And this was another reason I focused specifically on Badagry. But then even today we see on the pictures below, there is one of the attenuation well, which is what this well that was enchanted was called, and that still exists today. And we see that even today in the picture by the side, that Badagry remains at the periphery. And so these atrocities were committed hundreds, decades, very long ago. And even in present day, it's still underground, it's still facing erosion, unregulated sand mining, flooding, waste dumping. Next slide, please. And so this raises the question of what is being done about it? Well, how is the government responding to the issues in Badagry, right? And it's important to establish, first of all, that Nigeria is renowned for having strong laws. Unfortunately, they do not translate to effective implementation or enforcement, as the case may be. Nigeria has in its constitution sections, section 14, section 20, that provides for the responsibility and obligation on the part of the government to protect the environment, to prioritize and take care of the welfare and security of the Nigerian citizens. The Climate Change Act 2 also explicitly outlines adaptation measures, tries to highlight and make mainstream climate action in this regard. But once again, we see weak enforcement. We also see that the constitution that provides for the obligations of the government in this regard, those sections that the government are supposed to carry on, right? The obligation to ensure security, to ensure a protected environment are rendered non-justiciable. So there are laws, but then the enforcement remains a major issue. But then there is also fragmented authority that the agencies with the mandates of environmental protection, of responding and attending to the vulnerabilities of this community, this coastal community at the margin. There are several agencies in this regard with competing mandates, and what this translates to in reality is weak adaptation for those most affected. But then also in Badagry, we see this, and this is a term that some of us are probably not familiar with, but unregulated sand mining. And what that means is that, and this has been discussed in previous panels, that with climate displacement and that with movement being mostly internally within a territory, there is in some ways exodus to urban areas from rural areas. And in the case of Lagos, which happens to be an urban area, there is an influx of people coming into the city. And to accommodate the entry of more people into Lagos, it has led to some sort of housing boom, like more constructions going on. Unfortunately, purchasing sand is expensive, and what we see instead is the people, those that are constructing, go to Badagry, which is regarded as in the periphery either way, to mine sand. And so this is what I meant here with this term unregulated sand mining, for the expansion of these central urban areas that is accommodating the influx of people into Lagos. But what this does is that it has a real-time effects. It worsens coastal degradation, leads to flooding, coastal erosion, as the case may be, and also destroys the habitat. And this is a concern specifically for Badagry. And so what we see ultimately is this continuity, this extraction of the colonial logic of extracting from the peripheries to boost the center. That logic persists. We see it in the models, in the current development models of extracting, in this case, sand mining, sand specifically from this area at the periphery, because it's low cost, in order to privilege profit over protection. Next slide, please. And so to bring another case in point to show this privileging the center over the peripheries, this term that I used, I thought to spotlight this case of the Echo Atlantic project. And it's a major urban development built on reclaimed land close to Victoria Island, Lagos. And these areas are the really affluent parts of Lagos. But this project was designed to combat coastal erosion and flooding, and especially lead to or prioritize the construction of a so-called Great Wall of Lagos. The reality of it is that in actuality, the project has intensified erosion and ocean surges in nearby communities, which are often not as well off. And even informal settlements around have also been destroyed in the process. And what we see in this case is what Rice in her 2021 article refers to as climate apartheid, where resilience infrastructure in some ways is concentrated in wealthy enclaves, and where socioeconomic status in this regard, or affluence and luxurious areas, and wealth in this regard determines who is protected and who remains exposed. And so we see that in a lot of ways, wealth, capacities in this regard determines resilience, while those at the peripheries absorb risk. But then we also see another example of this, for example, and this has been discussed extensively, of how low carbon transitions in the global north mirror extraphism, because the cobalt, the lithium, the uranium that are integral for these transitions are also mined in Africa. But then the picture below also throws more light on this, because this is supposed to be a picture of the Grand Eco-Atlantic Project Plan. And then we see how luxurious it is. And upon its conclusion, not only is it real-time already affecting communities, but at the end of the day, this so-called place that is supposed to be a wall to protect Lagos is going to privilege the 1%ers, the tourists, the expatriates, and this is worth reflecting on. Thank you. Next slide, please. And so for the zooming in once again to Badagry in particular, we see that vulnerabilities cascade and run across different areas, across livelihoods, across gender, and ultimately culminating in what is perceived as structural violence. And so first of all, literature, and I could only put one. So first of all, because Badagry is a coastal city, most of its residents depend on fishing for their livelihood. But we see with climate change, the climate impact, real time of that is that erosion and saltwater intrusion reduces fish catches, right? So for these fisher folk, they have to travel further into sea to catch fishes. And because they also utilize boats that are rickety, not in its most optimal state, and that utilizes fur, this too is expensive. And so we see higher risks to their lives because they're traveling deeper into the water, but then also it reduces their profit margin. And we see also that for those that do farming, floods and desalination destroys the soils. And what this culminates in is falling yields and food insecurity. And then this, the vulnerability specific to Badagry also cascades to its cross-border trade, which is also a very important way to make money for the residents, but the damaged roads due to flooding, waterways disrupt cross-border commerce. We also see gendered impacts. Once again, women bear disproportionate livelihood losses and care burdens, because even with the fishing and the farming, they are central to fish processing, to trade, to selling of produce, and therefore with the reduction in yields in this regard and with catches, it reduces their own their own livelihood. It affects it, and what it means at the end of the day is heightened economic hardships. And so what we see as a result is a deepening economic precarity and inequality in this regard. Next slide, please. And so there is also what for the purpose of this presentation is termed as a waste colonialism and sacrificial zoning. One of Lagos's 6 unsanitary landfills is located in Badagry. We see, I try to put the pictures below because I do not know if everyone is familiar with the term landfills, but then in the global north, and for example, in Germany where I live, waste is often segregated, but this is not the case in countries like mine, for example, not to assume. And what this means is that waste that is not segregated, so both the biodegradable and non-biodegradable are lumped together and dumped in areas at the peripheries. And for the purpose of this research, of course, Badagry happens to be one of the places where these unsanitary landfills are located. The effect of this, more than the health implications for its residents over time, and the pungent smell and its effects on the environment, because this waste is left above the ground. What it translates to for the environment is mangrove loss, and then the hatcheries, contaminated hatcheries. And so it also depletes the fish hatcheries. And so we see that farmers with existing literature complain about the reduction in their catches, in their fish catches. And it's easy to complain about how this is necessitated or caused by the climate, but then also we see the man-made dimension here. And in some ways, how the government's neglect has culminated and contributed to the status quo. And so, oh my God, I can't believe the time is over. What this illustrates is sacrificial peripheries, where once again, spaces where urban centers offload environmental burdens. And it echoes what Nixon wrote about slow violence, where how harm accumulates invisibly. With each isolated case, it is regarded as minimal, but put together, we see how these factors come together to exacerbate vulnerabilities for people that have already, or for a site that has already witnessed injustices over the decades. Next slide, please. I think yes, this is, I'm almost done now.
So others could have their chance. Please finish up in the next few seconds.
Okay. 3 sentences.
30, yeah, 3 sentences is good.
So what we see is that the first, this was supposed to be another dimension because during the slave times, it was forced mobility, and now we see enforced immobility. And so this continuum of injustice persists. Those once forcibly taken are now forcibly contained. I think I wanted to end with the recommendations, but I think we can discuss that during the Q&A. Thank you very much, and apologies for exceeding my time.
And thank you very much, Chiamaka. And you know, the terrible structural violence of colonialism that we see continued even before climate change. We see this experience in Badagry. Sadly, you know, it's good to hear the specifics of the Badagry case, but we know this is happening in many places around the world where climate change is just exacerbating the previous structural violence. So thank you very much for sharing your study about this. And we will be coming back to recommendations certainly at the end. I want to turn now to Ike Uri, and he is a doctoral candidate in the sociology department at Brown University and a postdoctoral research at the University of Massachusetts Amherst. His work focuses on climate justice across contexts, and his primary project considers the politics of climate planning in Indian cities. Ike applies an ethnographic and organizational lens to analyze not only the outputs of planning efforts, but also the processes of creating and implementing climate-focused plans in major cities. Supported by a Fulbright Nehru Research Award, Ike's work has considered the growth of plans created through the International C40 Cities Climate Leadership Group in India, particularly the Mumbai Climate Action Plan. He spent 2 years based in Mumbai, embedded as a participant observer at the consulting firm that wrote the plan, where he followed early implementation efforts following the plan's launch and studied the impact of local politics and international norms on climate planning efforts. And I'll just allow Ike to give you the title to his presentation.
Thanks so much, Paul. And let me see if I can correctly share my screen. So 1 second. And I hope everyone can just see the presentation here. So yeah, thank you so much, Paul, for that introduction. And it really is such a privilege to participate in this panel and join in the important conversations happening at this symposium. So today I will be talking about urban climate-focused planning in India, which has gained significant traction in recent years. And in particular, I'm going to consider the creation and early implementation of the Mumbai Climate Action Plan, or the MCAP, as I'll frequently call it. This was the first city-level climate-focused plan created for a megacity in India, for any of the country's several megacities, and has achieved a degree of implementation and progress, and I use that term kind of in scare quotes here, rare not only in India, but internationally. So as a sociologist, my work centers on the processes and politics of creating climate action plans like the MCAP. And I consider not just the plans themselves, but the actors that drive this work and the political context in which this work is embedded, as well as the forms of expertise and knowledge that shape, in particular, how climate problems are defined and solutions are then subsequently framed. So in this presentation, I'm going to outline the creation and the early implementation of the MCAP and kind of discuss how it's exceeded expectations to some extent. And I'm going to then consider the implications of this for urban climate justice and speak in particular to questions of migrants in Mumbai for the theme of this symposium. And yeah, think about the sort of trade-offs that come with having a plan that is in some ways more effective and has gained a bit more traction, but leaves open some pretty serious questions concerning urban climate justice. So just as a point of background before I dive in, globally, cities are increasingly involved in the climate conversation. Cities have been identified as sites of climate problems where there's lots of pollution and climate vulnerability, but they're also frequently seen as sites of climate action and climate solutions. And this is particularly clear as cities around the world have created more and more climate action plans. And this is increasingly an expectation of cities globally, and any major city is essentially now expected to signal internationally that it's climate ready. And these efforts are often positioned within networks such as the C40 Cities Climate Leadership Group, that's perhaps the most prominent today, and there's a few others floating around. And within these spaces, cities increasingly seek recognition or validation or some demonstration of success that kind of fits in with a model of neoliberal urbanism, where cities are increasingly disconnected from the national contexts in which they are embedded and act independently on the international stage to attract capital and investment. And this is all kind of tied up with that. And these plans, particularly those created through C40, are intended to be comprehensive and take the entire city into account. And they're meant to mainstream climate action into existing governance structures and processes and planning mechanisms. That is to just make climate sort of a routine consideration rather than the task of donor-funded projects or more sporadic, perhaps like activism-driven approaches. So this work relies to a significant extent on best practices, and I use scare quotes with that as well, which are, assumed to be universally applicable and usually gleaned through the sort of entrepreneurial experimentation of particular cities. Now, it turns out many of them come from cities in the global north and are assumed to work anywhere in the world. But in the narratives used by C40 and other networks, cities are often assumed to be agentic and the ones leading this action. What I argue is that they're often not. It's usually non-governmental folks, including consultants or climate experts or practitioners, who not only actually lead this work, but also lead international discussions on this work and kind of drive the international field of urban climate action. So this work is simultaneously local and international, right? It's happening in particular cities, often with people who have varying degrees of connection to the place. And it's often oriented toward an international audience to, again, sort of signal a commitment to climate action. So I'm going to turn now to the, well, before I guess I move on, I'm going to discuss my methods a little bit. So I focus primarily on the Mumbai Climate Action Plan in my work. Like Paul mentioned, I spent 2 years in Mumbai as a participant observer at the World Resources Institute India, which is the organization that wrote the Mumbai Climate Action Plan and led its early implementation. And this is a branch of WRI, the Washington, D.C. based think tank and research organization, but does operate with some independence from that international umbrella organization. So, and I'm happy to answer more questions on methods later, but I'm going to skip over those for now just to privilege focusing on the plan a bit more. So the Mumbai Climate Action Plan was originally motivated by state level politics in 2019. Following state level elections, a new and sort of young, energetic Minister of Climate and Environment was interested in promoting climate planning in Mumbai. And he suggested that the city rejoin C40. Its membership had lapsed before. And as part of that rejoining, C40 insisted that Mumbai create a climate action plan, or a C40, excuse me. It necessitates that those plans be created by and centered within urban governments. However, the Brihan Mumbai Municipal Corporation, the picture of which is on the right side of your screen, Mumbai's urban government, or the BMC, lacked the capacity for this work. So the state level ministry reached out to WRI India to come on as a knowledge partner to the BMC. And this is a bit euphemistic. They really like led the entire planning process, given capacity constraints within the urban government. So WRI staff liaised between the BMC and state politicians in C40 to conduct background research in 2020 and 2021 and write the climate plan, which was launched in early 2022. And shortly after that launch, there were political disruptions at the state level. The government essentially collapsed, or the coalition government that was in control fell apart, and the minister in question lost his job. And so the political mandate for this work disappeared. But BMC officials remained interested in the work because of the international recognition that had sort of began to pour in over the first climate action plan created for C40 in South Asia. And they asked WRI to sort of come back and begin leading this international outreach because they had trouble doing this themselves. And WRI took this opportunity to gain rapport within the urban government and suggest implementation steps. So they filled what, and I'm kind of using organizational sociological terms here, but they essentially operated as brokers. They were liaisons between C40 and the BMC, which are organizations that exist in very different spaces. So I argue there's this international field of urban climate action, which is where C40 is located, and best practices for urban climate action sort of are the currency that is traded amongst practitioners and consultants. And the local field of Indian urban governance, which is run by a very different set of actors and involves a very different set of politics and motivations. WRI staff were embedded in both fields. They're from Mumbai and knew the local government well, and their work was primarily positioned within the international field of urban climate action. So they acted as translators in a sense to modify best practices and instantiate them in a more sort of acceptable or reasonable form in the urban government. And conversely, they took progress that was occurring within the BMC and framed it in terms of best practices so that it would be legible to international audiences and gain the city the sort of recognition that urban officials desired. So I argue that this all took place through a sort of strategic incrementalism. Transformational change, which I think we all probably know is increasingly emphasized in climate-focused literature, that is addressing the root causes of climate vulnerability or emissions, was not really politically tenable. You couldn't walk into the urban government and say, we need structural change. We need to completely change how the city's economy works. We need to address deep forms of marginalization. That's not a conversation that you can really have. So they took a more incremental approach, and they advocated two changes, which were to increase the size of the environment department and to institute a C40 best practice called climate budgeting, which is essentially a form of monitoring and evaluation. And I outline in a paper that I'm working on now and in some other places how WRI staff essentially translated these international best practices into climate policies that they layered on top of existing institutions within the BMC. So they changed the size and the mandate of the environment department. It grew from 1 person to about 50. And they instituted climate budgeting in 2024. So this is an annual process on top of the existing urban budgeting process. And it's kind of a marginal additional shift that ideally provides some accountability and formalizes climate as a concern within the urban government. So these changes are incremental, but I think they are significant. And for those of you who know Indian urban governments, know that it's intransigent often and sort of inflexible, and change is often remarkably difficult, in part because of the relatively insignificant power granted to urban governments in India. Power remains in urban settings primarily vested in the state government. And so the fact that this could sort of happen in the urban government was in a way remarkable. And what I want to emphasize is that climate has been formalized as a concern in Mumbai. Now, it doesn't mean that the urban government has become this locus of climate action, but technically there are ways to lodge grievances and to point at these new mechanisms for monitoring and evaluation, or go to the environment department that has more people in it now and claim climate grievances, or point out areas where there's not been enough action. And this is a pretty significant shift. So in a way, the Mumbai Climate Action Plan has been effective, and the approach taken by WRI staff with urban officials, including some very sympathetic urban officials, has been in a way effective, leading to this implementation that outpaces not only the implementation of any other urban climate plan in India, but also many of these C40 climate plans internationally. But I think it's worth asking sort of at what cost has this efficacy come? And I'll talk a little bit about implications of this for climate justice, and then end with speaking a bit about implications for migrants in particular. So Mumbai is famously India's most cosmopolitan city. It is a city very much of migrants, but there is significant contention in Mumbai over who counts as a local. And this has informed the politics of Mumbai and Maharashtra for decades, particularly since the 1960s and the rise of the Shiv Sena. For those of you that know Mumbai, may know about this regional nativist and far right-wing party that is famously anti-migrant and anti-Muslim. And I'm not going to go into any more detail here. I can answer questions in the Q&A, but in the city, in part because of these politics and because of other factors, caste, religion, and ethnicity and language are significant forms of marginalization in the city that operate in sometimes very overt ways through protests or riots, and sometimes in very covert ways through where you're allowed to rent or get housing or seek education and other sort of more subtle factors. And these things also affect, these factors rather, also affect other things that we know impact climate vulnerability, such as service provision or access to political representation and voice. So these are deeply connected to questions of power in the city. And this doesn't have to just do with migrants or newcomers to the city. And when I say migrant, I'm speaking here mostly about domestic migrants to Mumbai. So people who are coming from other parts of India, often trying to seek economic opportunity. But also impacts people who've been in the city for quite some time, depending on their background. And like I said before, migration has been extremely divisive in the city. Rhetoric, particularly from the Shiv Sena, this far right-wing party, was formerly directed at South Indians and is now primarily directed at North Indians in the city. And folks who come from often economically disadvantaged backgrounds to the city can face significant discrimination that undoubtedly has implications for their vulnerability to the effects of climate change, which in the city, I know I haven't really spoken about climate hazards, but I'm trying to emphasize here the importance of these social factors more than just the climate hazards that are often emphasized in the literature. But in Mumbai, is mostly heat and sea level rise connected with more erratic rainfall, particularly during the monsoon season, so urban flooding. These issues are not acknowledged in the MCAP. In short, caste is mentioned once or twice. Religion and ethnicity or language are not mentioned at all. And this is because the plan was created in this political context where, though some rhetoric has moderated from the Shiv Sena's height in the 90s and the early 2000s, it's still very difficult to bring up these questions of particularly religion or ethnicity. It would, in a sense, politicize the climate issue in a way that would make it difficult to talk about, in a sense of trying to get to the root causes of climate change, or trying to make the Mumbai Climate Action Plan or any climate action plan transformational, would politicize it too much to be able to talk about it within the BMC or with state level politicians. So in a sense, keeping it as a technical plan insulates it from that, and focusing more on some relatively benign metrics of social indicators of vulnerability and climate hazards helps to perhaps make the plan more effective, but leaves these root causes of climate vulnerability unaddressed. In India, as elsewhere, migrants in cities are in a very precarious position for many reasons, not just because of climate, but climate seems to be likely a compounding factor. And in India, this is particularly true because migrants within the country are often treated as sort of the responsibility of the place from which they come. That is, if you are a migrant in a different part of the country, and this has happened with a couple other climate disasters in recent years, and something happens, it's not necessarily the responsibility of the state in which you're living to take care of you, but it's the responsibility of the state from which you come from, and that leads to a lot of contention over rescue efforts or other sort of responses to climate, particularly climate disasters. So this raises really clear questions about how migrants in cities may receive recognition and justice in the form of recognition, and how procedural or distributive justice, the two sort of core constitutive parts of climate justice, can be affected or be brought about if we can't even recognize these populations. And it's important to emphasize it's also very difficult to enumerate these populations. There hasn't been a census in India since 2011. And regardless, it's very difficult to understand even where migrants live or who's a migrant sometimes in cities. And often folks try to lay low when they're in those situations. And so this raises broader contention over trade-offs that are inherent to urban climate planning. And these trade-offs are, and I'm just going to conclude by saying these trade-offs are over not only making a plan politically palatable versus addressing the root causes of climate change, but also over trying to figure out where to center the locus of climate action, whether it should be a responsibility of the urban government or the responsibility of activists positioned outside of and perhaps in opposition to the urban government, raises questions over greenwashing and other issues. But I'm going to conclude here, and I'm looking forward to questions during the Q&A. Thank you so much.
And thank you very much, Ike. Hearing about how climate action is working or not working, as the case may be, in one of the great cities of the world, Mumbai, and then also juxtaposing what you've been talking about with Chiamaka's description of Lagos and Badagry especially, well, there's a lot there. We don't have any questions yet, so I'm just going to mention this. So after Lin Ta's presentation, I am going to allow or encourage our three speakers to address one another and see if they have questions or comments about one another's presentations. Just wanted to mention that before we go ahead. Now then, so moving towards our third presentation, Lin Ta is a dedicated advocate and researcher specializing in human rights, environmental issues, and migration. She graduated with distinction from the University of Bristol in the United Kingdom, earning her master's degree in international law. She holds a bachelor's degree in law from Hanoi Law University. Lin is the founder of Green Path Migrants, a social awareness campaign for climate migrants in Southeast Asia and Vietnam. And with that, I turn it over to Lin Ta.
Hi, I think my camera and thing was not as being disabled by the host.
Just rectified that.
Yep, you can see me well, right?
Yes, we can.
Just a second for me. And then this is here. Yes, you can see my slide as well, right?
Yes, we can.
Hi everyone. My name is Lin Ta, and sadly my co-researcher Migrant will not join us today. She will be joining us for the Q&A session. I will represent our research team and presenting our research title, Capacity Building and Urban Integration of Climate Migration, Narrative, Policy, and Practice in the Great Lakes region. To this aim, to tell everyone first that at the current state of our research, we are only at the why. So why is there a question about capacity building and urban integration of climate migration in the Great Lakes? Why should we care about this region and this topic? Please keep in mind that throughout our presentation that whatever policy, practice, and narrative are in place, the aim of our research is to provide an overall picture of the situation at hand and prepare the Great Lakes community with clear understanding to better plan the urban infrastructure and ultimately building a stronger capacity for the region. So today we will going over three main questions. On the first, the second, and the third part of this presentation. The first question talking about what do we mean while we're saying climate migration, and the second is what is the situation of climate migration in the US in general and in the Great Lakes region in specific. What kind of practice or policy are in place to tackle this particular issue, and whether any of, and the third question is whether any of this action constitute a narrative in the Great Lakes, and are these US narratives so much different than the current global movement for climate migration? As we only have roughly 50 minutes to go over all this big topic, I will be very selective today and try to give you a general answer to the first few initial part of the question. Feel free to ask us any question in the Q&A. So okay, let's start with the first interesting part, definition. So climate migration refers to the movement of a person or group of people for a reason of sudden or progressive change in the environment due to climate change are obligated to leave their habitual place of residence or choose to do so. Simply put, maybe that we can only simply see that climate mobility refers to any kind of human movement, whether it's forced, it's voluntary, it's temporary, it's permanent, whether it happen within a country or cross-border. But all of these movements share one thing in common, is that it takes place in the context of climate change. And because of that, we separate them into three categories, as you can see on the slide: disaster displacement, climate migration, and planet relocation. In some cases, it is an extreme event that relate to climate change, like disaster and flood, that often know a sudden onset event that had a direct cause that forced people to leave their home. We call this group of people climate or disaster-induced displacement. But it's not always a single big event that make people move. Often it's a slow process of things like drought, rising sea level, changing rainfall pattern that gradually push people to leave their home and look for a safer or better place to live. Since in this case, people usually have more time to plan and have a choice in the way that they move. We call this kind of movement climate migration. Unlike the type of movement that we just talked about, they are one that kind of more systematic and organized rather than spontaneous. And this is called planned relocation. Relocation is a process where individual and community are supported by government planning to move or resettle in a safer area. And we want to stress that all of this type of movement happen in the US. But how is it actually? Well, we will often say it's quite depend. A boring and oversimplified answer, but it's a choose. It's a choose because if we want to look to a fact now, we can say that climate change is clearly having a major impact across the US. For example, in the Northeast, heat wave, heavy rainfall, and rising sea level are putting pressure on infrastructure, while in the Northwest is struggling with lower water supply, worsening wildfires, and forest die-off. In the Southeast, rising sea and extreme heat threaten both the economy and public health, while the Midwest face more frequent flood and heat wave. Once we establish that climate change is happening in the US, we can come back to our initial first category of climate migrant, which we refer here as climate disaster, as disaster displacement. So in the US, they often refer to these two subgroups by dividing them into external disaster displacement person and internal displaced person. With external displaced person, we know that the US do not recognize this particular subgroup of that fall into the count of refugeehood. Because of that, we don't really have a data of how many exactly people who seek refugeehood in the US are actually categorized as climate refugee or external disaster displaced person coming to the US. However, we know that in 2019, there were 27,500 people who received refugee status in the US. And most recently, last year, we have a cases of a person who seek refugee under the category of due to climate change. We know that it's not success at the moment, and because of that, it's very easy for us to say that with this category group, we don't really know whether the US is actually any climate refugee, as we so called that. However, we do have a very strong data on internal displaced person who have to flee due to severe natural disaster in the US. The number we have found today that between 2008 and 2024, the US has about 22.3 million cases of internal disaster displacement. When we look at the second subgroup, climate migration, again, we don't really have any data on this particular group because there's not been any research on this issue. However, if we want to take a case study, it's very easy for us to look back at what happened with the Hurricane Katrina and what happened in New Orleans, Louisiana, and Florida following this particular crisis. When I talk about planned relocation, we have a look and then we found that there was about 17 communities that have received federal funding project. However, it is not often very popular, and most of this movement is actually voluntary location and community building and receive quite little federal funding. We come back to the question of if that is happening in the US in general, is this something that is also happening in the Great Lake as well? Well, as you can see from the screen, why there's a lot of talk recently for the past few years about the Great Lake area, there's no available data whatsoever on all of this disaster displacement, climate migration, and planned relocation within the Great Lake itself. However, when we look at the root cause of why we have to categorize this group of people and this group of phenomenon happening in the region, we'll be able to say certain things. For example, with disaster displacement, we have to ask the question of, are people in the Great Lake region, which is consisting of 8 US states and province of Ontario in Canada, has recently been widely claimed as climate change might make the region into a climate haven. But in disaster displacement happening in the Great Lake, do people move from the Great Lake or to the Great Lake? Is there any planning for relocation of community in the climate vulnerable area? Well, we have to say that even though this is supposed to be a safe net for hazard effect of climate change and disaster displacement, the Great Lake region is not immune to its own risk. The area abundant fresh water may offer some advantage. However, but rising flood threat could bring significant destruction. And even though there's no direct data about this, we have information about flood during the 19 to 2000 high water period that caused roughly $500 million in damage, as well as a powerful 2020 storm Crystal brought severe flooding, sinkhole, and destruction to many infrastructure. This data indicate that even if flood does not directly displace a person in the Great Lake area, it indirect impact Great Lake residents with a familiar indicator, which is economic. At the same time, we're talking about climate migration. Existing literature recognize that people are moving to the Great Lake region to hide from climate change. We know that Lake Superior, Michigan, Huron, Erie, and Ontario together hold 21% of the world's fresh water. And beyond its aquatic resources, the region also shields from extreme weather such as hurricane, tornado, flood, wildfire. However, it still remains uncertain whether large-scale climate migration to the rural Great Lake region has truly begun, because researchers have noted that much such movement is still very limited, and most studies focus on what people expect to happen rather than what is occurring now. And so far, there hasn't been any major planned relocation in the Great Lake region. Past example like federal-funded ICE the John George project in Louisiana show that how complicated large-scale out-of-state resettlement can be. And because of that, replicating this model for community could not be something that happen right away or already in planning. Which brings us to the question of, is there any practice that is in place right now to tackle this particular kind of issue happening in the US? So if we look at the first category of disaster displacement, we know that if we separate them again in external and internal disaster displacement group, we see that with external, in 2022, there was a Refugee Protection Act that provides persons who seek refugeehood in the US with temporary protection status. However, it's not that they are giving them a refugeehood due to claiming about fleeing due to disaster and climate change, but only a temporary status to stay in the US. However, we know that these with the new admission, when we're looking back at the cut on refugee from like 25,000 and we're talking about in 2019 to just about roughly 77,000 people now, it's very less likely that the US would welcome people using the status of climate refugee. But with that aside, if we're talking about internal disaster displacement, then the policy within the US actually merged quite a lot with the climate migration, with the different subgroup we're talking about. So in 2021, we have a report on the impact of climate change on migration by the White House, which subsequently planning from the Bureau of Population, Refugee and Migration that's stressing and recognizing the impact of climate change on migration. However, it's good to come back to the fact that with the new admission, most of these innovative climate action could be very easy to be invoked. It's really depend on who gonna hold power next and what is the next move of a new president to either to sign up more with environmental treaty or to take it all out again. So talking about planet relocation, I had talked before about the 17 community that have been given funding or having support to relocate with the fear of environmental degradation and subsequent migration due to climate change. And we have some case study here of the ID zone charts again. However, it's very good to take a look at this case study in terms of that. Not only that they not really receive a lot of federal funding, but they actually mostly come from a support from the area as well as joining competition. And throughout is at only very small scale as well as one of the very first cases that the US was supporting this particular group of people, and up until now it's been not very successful. It's come back to us again about how the Great Lakes region react to this particular issue. When we're talking about the situation earlier, we know that this is something that's happening in the US. We know that the US only have very limited resources and policy practice to support this particular issue. However, we have also encountered a lot of news about how the Great Lakes is being a new haven, is becoming a destination for people to move to. However, up until this moment of our research, we do not found any planning in place, even if with capacity building and urban resettlement planning for the Great Lake region to tackling this particular issue of climate migration towards them or within them. However, we do know and want to consider the fact that what is the potential direction could be and how it could look like. We think about how the in-state strategies that reduce climate threat without federal funding, by doing proactive buyout, zoning changes, and moving residents to higher ground, as well as with support to move in and helping people within the area. Oh my God, I'm really running out of time. I'm very sorry. However, we want to go to this one thing that I want to conclude on, which is that we even know there's a lot of things going on within the US and the Great Lakes region, and there's no planning and no idea about this issue, whether it's happening or not. What is important for us to talk about is that it shows how the US is moving forward with this issue and how the Great Lakes region is tackling this issue by looking at the different narrative that our research is going forward to understanding how policy, how the reaction of people actually making a point about whether you should care about this issue and whether the region could be able to prepare for this in the future. Thank you a lot. Yes, I'm very sorry.
Well, thank you. Oh, get my video here. Thank you very much, Kan-Lin. And so many of our presentations in this symposium have been about the developing world. So it's really helpful to have, hearing your analysis of the US context, kind of to juxtapose. And I will say that as a resident of Kalamazoo, Michigan, sort of at the heart of the Great Lakes region, my anecdotal experience is very consistent with your analysis. So thank you for that.
Yeah, thank you.
And so right now, we don't have any open questions. So I will do what I suggested earlier, and that is I will ask our three speakers to unmute themselves and to show their videos and see if they might have comments or questions for one another. And I believe that Kan-Lin's fellow researcher, there's a first-year JD candidate at Harvard Law School who's been working with her, who is going to also join in for the Q&A session. Is Mai Nguyen able to join us? Oh, Mai is not here.
She did say she's joining at attendee.
Okay, so why don't we continue with the session, and I will at the end try to work through the tech with Mai to have her join.
Yeah, I think she's here as attendee. Yeah, thank you.
So first I'll ask, we'll go in order of our presentations. Chiamaka, do you have any comments for your fellow speakers? And please unmute yourself.
I just realized that. Apologies. No, not really. I don't.
Ike?
Hi everyone, sorry about the tech issues.
Yeah, I guess I'll just start with some comments, and then maybe we can get into some questions or something. But Chiamaka, your presentation was really interesting, and I appreciated the drawing the connections between so many historic, deep historic questions and modern, contemporary climate problems. And particularly, you just briefly mentioned the concept of eco-apartheid, and you showed this great wall of Legos, I think, which was sort of fascinating and disturbing, along with other images. And I guess I'd be interested in hearing more. You talked about sort of the governance mechanisms, the laws, and sort of ways in which climate is formalized as sort of a responsibility of the state, but it's not happening in a very fair or just way. So like, what are the mechanisms that kind of have perpetuated that? And for Conlon, I agree with Paul. It was really nice to have a focus on the Great Lakes and something that's pretty close to home, including a little bit close to home for me, I guess. And but I guess just in terms of, you cited some sort of data gaps, but I'm wondering if you could maybe talk a little bit more about like how we could begin to measure these, if climate migration is occurring, and where we could begin to look for these signals, and maybe if it's not in kind of conventional data, like where might we kind of see that?
So let me ask Chiamaka to respond first.
Thank you. Towards the end, I wasn't so clear about what you wanted to know, but I thought to start with your questions on where the laws are in this regard and the policies. And I mentioned it earlier in the presentation. With my country, there is often a plethora of laws, and it starts really from our ground norm, the Constitution, and it provides in Section 14 the responsibility of the government to protect the climate, to protect the environment is used, not the word climate. But in this way, we see the onus of the government to take the lead in safeguarding both the climate, both the citizens, and to protect them from harm. But what we see, and I've discussed this at length already, is that these sections of the Constitution that puts obligations, responsibilities on the government were rendered in a separate section as non-justiciable. And so what it means is that the citizens are unable to demand the enforcement of these rights that they are entitled to. And so what we see in my country is the laws that are there that speak. Currently in Lagos State, there is a regulation on sand mining. So ideally, it should not be allowed for companies to take their vehicles and mine the sand. There are regulations specifically against that, but once again, enforcement becomes a problem. And so it seems in some ways that the government's laxity in this regard, like it's forthcoming with laws, but there is no feedback loop, there's no enforcement mechanisms. And so what it means is that the status quo remains. There is the Climate Change Act too in Nigeria that is regarded as highly progressive because it sets targets for zero emission targets. Yes, this is something that it does. It basically tries to mainstream climate action. So it says a lot on paper, but in reality, we don't see that. And so I try to connect that to the tendency of the government to just be disinterested in this. So what I put forth is that this is a model that is more about extracting from the peripheries to profit those that are at the center, those that are more affluent, those that have better interests from the perspective of the government, and therefore others other areas that are right at the peripheries, it's right at the coast, are sidelined. And so I don't plan to take much time, but this, I think I got the impression that was the question you were asking. And if you have any more of this is not clear, I don't know if my details are around, that you can always send me more. Thank you.
Conlene, do you want to respond?
Is this okay? You repeat the question for me. Sorry.
Of course. Yeah, I mean, so you were highlighting in your presentation this sort of problem that I think we all know is a problem, right, of climate migration to displacement, but you sort of highlighted some data gaps and like it's a little bit difficult to measure. And sort of where do you think we could maybe look for those data, or if not in sort of a conventional source, maybe how could we ascertain what's going on in a way that could inform policymakers?
So, so when we start researching about climate migration, the first thing that we often encounter is that the fact that there's no common definition on what we are talking about, and because of that, we need to separate into subgroup of certain based on certain phenomenon and from the phenomenon we find data. For example, if we want to find data on disaster displacement, and we don't have that kind of information that at hand, we need to look at data about how that area be affected by disaster, like what we have been doing with the Great Lake area, and how it's kind of merged into whether they have to make a connection themselves in doing that kind of thing, especially with area or region that is not being talking about much. So my specialty actually I actually specialize in researching about climate migration in Southeast Asia and ASEAN region. And when I jump into this project with mine, we start talking about the Great Lake area, I jump into with where's all my data, because the US has not been talking about this particular issue and it's not in place that yet. However, a lot of that is like at the moment there's a lot of data too that are in place. However, we depend on whether the country and region really interested on providing funding for this kind of group that they kind of do and giving you data on this particular issue. So to answer the question again, there's two things that we can do. First is strictly able to categorize what you are looking for based on the kind of phenomenon that you are want to find data on. And secondly, is to find the support from current research about and certain data, because especially in the US, when you have a lot of resources and a lot of research lab about this particular issue, if they want to find data about this, they will and they can. But whether they are funding, whether they are interested, and whether they are prospect of what is actually happening, that then we have data. Thank you.
We do have a question now from our audience, from Maria Amarian for Chiamaka. How do you see community-led initiatives balancing urgent adaptation with long-term historical reparations?
So that's, first of all, Maria, thank you for your question. I see the role of community-led initiatives as important. Within the context of my research, I didn't find a lot of that. I do know there exists, but I did not find. But I think community-led initiatives have a way, or are already doing this balancing and responding to other urgent adaptation in this sense. But then thinking more critically on this, I don't think it's the community's responsibility to address historical reparations in this regard. It's the community in this sense. This is the same site where it was perpetrated and not by them. And so I think this should be channeled to the West. I think the community, it's not within their scope to address historical reparations, perhaps to demand for it, to make concerted efforts to amplify the need for reparative action in this regard, for the replication of a model like the Loss and Damage Fund, one that addresses specifically historical injustices. But I didn't see that. I don't think it's the responsibility of the communities to handle historical reparations, but I do know that there are community-led initiatives. Unfortunately, I didn't find that. Thank you.
Thank you. And since we haven't had questions directed at Ike, I'm gonna bring a question for Ike. And that is, when we see Chiamaka's describing the people kind of on the periphery who are being neglected, and then you're describing the Mumbai Climate Action Plan that is being put into place, but that has a hard time because of the political situation, dealing with ethnicity, dealing with caste, dealing with some of these issues that are political, kind of hot potatoes. Do you think that basically that we would find the same issues that Chiamaka is finding in terms of like the more marginalized populations just getting ignored, or maybe even having more hardship, and the plan mostly focusing on, the relatively speaking, in that context, relatively elite problems and issues? I don't know, just or is there a place in there for the more marginalized population, one way or another?
Yeah, there's some nuance, I think, in how that focus might unfold, and this has to do, I think, with, again, sort of who, like I brought up this idea of, there's different gradations of locality in Mumbai of who's sort of allowed to make a claim to the city or a right to the city. And many poor people are on the sort of are part of a group who can make those claims. And so one criticism of the MCAP was that there wasn't enough engagement with local communities, which is almost certainly true. But a lot of the focus was on the concern was with why folks who at WRI who planned the MCAP, who wrote the MCAP, didn't reach out to the Koli fishing communities. And so the Kolis are a lower caste community that is located along the western coast of India, but has a significant presence in Mumbai. And these folks are often considered the true natives of the city. And this is kind of elevated in popular narratives. And in a sense, it's completely trying to center a Koli fishing population, many of whom do live actually on the coast and are extremely vulnerable to sea level rise and are having their livelihoods affected. But it would not be as okay to maybe highlight the plight of migrants from North India or something who are kind of under a particular sort of discursive threat at the moment in the city. So it's not to say that poor communities can't be focused on. I think it's a question of who's in the community. And then there's also a question of how that framing is done. So there was some effort by WR staff, and I don't want to sort of elevate them more than too much, but to sort of focus on particularly poor areas of the city or slums or informal settlements in ways that maybe were not centered around ethnicity or language or caste, but were focused more just on the physical conditions of where people were living and highlighting those like service provision concerns or something, or risks of landslides during the rain was something that is focused on in the plan. So I think there are ways to sort of do this, but I think the concerns that Chiamaka raised are very important and germane and also present in a place like Mumbai, but there's multiple things going on.
And Chiamaka, because I had to cut you off, you did say you had some sort of practical recommendations that you didn't have time to discuss. Do you want to come back to some of those points?
Yes, I unmute myself now. So basically I'll run through them because it's 11 p.m. my time and I'm half asleep. But then the first is on legal reforms. So I remember I stopped in the part where there was enforced mobility at some point, and now people are rendered involuntarily immobile, and so that calls for legal reforms in this regard, but then also for better environmental governance and enforcement of regulations specifically. And I already mentioned in response to the question that if Ike raised about the importance of enforcement of regulations. The sand mining, there is a regulation in that regard, but then there is still a lot of reluctance on the part of the government to enforce this. Next is on equitable finance in light of the vulnerabilities of these coastal communities that cuts across different sectors. For the fishers, for the farmers, for those in cross-border trade, it will be imperative to try to ease, in some ways, mitigate the precarity in this regard, and that should encompass funding being made available, funding that is both community-led, funding that is both gender responsive, but then funding that is simplified in the way that communities can apply for them easily and be capacitated on the know-how on how to apply for them effectively. But then also, and I also touched on this too, extending the loss and damage logic to historical harms. And this is a conversation we are not having. We speak a lot about climate action, but integral to this is to spotlight historical harms, historical injustice, and how they shape present-day precarity. And that's a conversation people don't want to have. And even with loss and damage, the governments are trying to pay, but then absolve themselves of accountability. And we see this replicating itself. And that is something that cannot be in the same sentence if we're agitating for justice. Justice means going back, going forward, looking at the present, and thinking about how everyone fares. Thank you.
Yeah, when you talk about people of Badagry being able to apply for funds, I do want to put that in the context of our broader framing of this whole symposium, because what we see is that the international community through the UNFCCC process has about $120 billion that developed countries have been using to support mitigation adaptation in developing countries, but so far a tiny a pittance to address the needs of climate migrants. And now there's a new awareness of that, and a bit with loss and damage. But part of our whole framing of this symposium is that we're involved in advocacy that these resources, we need to be focusing on the most vulnerable victims. And certainly the people of Badagry would seem to fit pretty well within that context. And yet we also know the way these institutions work is if you want the money, you have to ask for it. You have to put in a proposal. This is my personal question then. Can you imagine a scenario where somehow Badagry puts in a proposal to, I don't know, Green Climate Fund, or what would have to happen for that to be possible?
I think that would be Herculean. First of all, the know-how, very difficult, but then it would also require for the residents to even gain climate literacy in this regard, to be aware of what is going on, to be able to communicate that in the terms required and in line with institutional requirements. That would be a major undertaking. And my focus in this regard, because of how difficult it will be, is to amplify existing research on climate literacy and how it might undermine efforts in this regard. There is the study by Simpsons in 2021 and Amakri in 2023, which talks about how climate literacy in the African region, and I imagine also for Badagry, is really limited. So from 23% to 66%, and that's a major gap, that's a major border. And so it will be a really Herculean task in this regard. And so a lot of conversations are had about financing, but the practicalities of it are not discussed. And that's something that I hope to highlight in the recommendations.
And with all of our presentations that we're seeing, it's such a moving target, and the situation, what it is today, 5 years, 10 years from now, it can be very different. Okay, for Kan-Lin, so as I live here in Michigan, just kind of informally, well, one thing not informally, we know that Michigan, like other Midwestern states, has been, relatively speaking, losing population prior to whole climate change situation. And so from that perspective, if people are moving from Florida or California because of climate risk to Michigan, Michigan has lots of empty homes. And so yeah, come. But I'll also say that even though there's no data, certainly just anecdotally, what I hear from people, I don't suspect there's a lot of sort of government, involved plan relocation, but I think there's a lot of people, again, in climate vulnerable places where they've had forest fires and floods and terrible hurricanes, and they're moving. Some number of them definitely are moving. And if you looked up at the Traverse City area in terms of property prices up there, there's certain hot spots of internal migration. I'm just wondering how you see the relationship between sort of these informal movements. And I'll also say that in terms of even international climate migrants to the United States, where we're not talking about people getting asylum, we're talking about people in Guatemala having floods, and then they just make their way and they cross the border illegally, and they wouldn't even think of themselves as climate migrants, but they are. It was climate change that displaced them. And again, we don't have numbers on that, but we know that that's a phenomenon. So I wonder how you see these informal flows relative to the issues you're talking about.
I will leave the first part of the question to Mai to answer, but I want to answer the second part, which talked about external migration towards the US using the climate change claim. One thing we know, like throughout the world, is really hard to categorize a person by saying that they are moving somewhere because of climate change. It's often different layers of reason behind someone movement. They often come and they often talk more about economics and economic region and job seekings or a better life in general, not just about climate change. So even though we can very easily try to count how many people moving anywhere as climate migrant, with even though they are not seeking refugeehood under this category, it's still very hard to pinpoint out exactly how many people there is. However, I did mention earlier about in the US itself that there are people that trying to make the claim to stay in US under with the protection under climate change, and it shows that even though the majority of people don't want to use that kind of language yet about refugee, that there's still something that is happening, and there might be that kind of change in global now that people try to open up the refugee definition to be including climate change, following their being displaced by disaster from their home country towards certain country, including the US. So that is, I hope that answers a little bit about the question of how kind of like to tackle this particular issue, because at the moment there's still so much uncertainty about how do we locating and talking and telling about these people, even though we can see from our eye that disaster is happening, climate change is happening, but whether these people who move there will say themselves that they are climate migrant or climate refugee is a different issue. But I will give it the mic to Mai to talk about the situation in the Great Lake. Like we do have a good point about it, but I never got to that point when I was speaking earlier.
Yeah, thank you for your question. It's really interesting that you brought up the first part of it about how, although at the moment we do not have a formal system that categorizes someone as climate refugees, even if they're just moving internally within the country. So when we were doing our research, most migration pattern that is induced by climate change will lead to people still moving within the state. So you can see somebody, say, moving from Philadelphia to Pittsburgh to like avoid hurricane or flooding, for example. But there hasn't been a lot of examples of people moving completely out of state, especially from somewhere like Florida to Michigan. A couple of examples we found was the relocation effort with native tribal groups that were entirely displaced by the impact of climate change, like in their hometown. But that is one of the rare examples where they would either need to win large competitive grants from state and federal funding to make the move possible, or there needs to be philanthropical efforts to relocate them. And although the migration to the Great Lakes for climate reasons is not a reality yet, we posit that if it ever becomes the case, there will be conflicting narratives on this. We wouldn't be surprised if there are a large group that see these people as the victim, like deserving of humanitarian aid. They're vulnerable because their hometown is destroyed by climate change and now they deserve to find refuge. There will be other narrative that see them more as the adaptee. This is basically what they need to do in order to survive, and they will just pick a place that best meet their future needs to continue their life with minimum disruptions. But we would also suspect that there would be narrative that frame these people as a threat, as the people that coming in and displace the local population coming in and gentrifying the neighborhood. So although we might be seeing decreasing population in Michigan, it's not the case that the people that come in will always be welcome. Yeah, so that's like a couple of thoughts that we had while doing this research.
Thanks very much, Maya. I'm glad that we got to have your participation here. And we have now reached our time. So thank you very much to our 3 presenters and Maya coming in at the last minute. We're grateful. I'm glad you could. And thank you also to our audience. Again, we have presentations going through 10 p.m. Eastern time this evening. Very interesting presentations, and then through from 6 a.m. till 5 p.m. tomorrow. So please look at the future at the presentations panels that will still be available. And thank you so much for your participation in this symposium.
Thank you a
Thank
lot.
you.
Thank you.
Thanks. Bye.